The phone rings. You already know you're not going to answer it. Not because you don't care, not because you're busy, but because somewhere deep in your chest, something tightens at the idea of needing something from someone else. You'd rather figure it out yourself. You'd rather stay up until 2 a.m. researching, rearranging, problem-solving, alone than make one phone call asking for help. And the strangest part, that feels normal to you. That feels safe. If you grew up somewhere between 1965 and 1980, there's a good chance this is your default setting. Not a quirk, not a preference, a survival strategy that got so deeply embedded into your nervous system that it started to feel like personality. But here's what nobody tells you about that kind of independence. It has a cost, and most people who carry it don't even know they're paying it. There's a psychological pattern that researchers have started calling hyperindependence. And it doesn't mean what most people think it means. It's not strength. It's not discipline. It's not even really a choice. It's a nervous system that learned very early that needing people was dangerous. And Gen X didn't just stumble into this pattern. They were practically trained for it. Think about what it meant to grow up in the late 70s and early 80s in America. Latchkey kids, divorce rates hitting record highs, both parents working longer hours, Reagan-era individualism seeping into every corner of the culture. The message wasn't just implied, it was explicit. Pull yourself up, figure it out, don't be a burden. A whole generation absorbed that message at exactly the wrong age during childhood and adolescence, when the brain is still wiring itself, when the nervous system is still deciding, is the world a safe place? Can I trust people to show up? Will asking for help get me what I need? Or will it just remind me that nobody's coming? For millions of Gen Xers, the answer the environment gave them was quiet, consistent, and devastating. Probably don't count on it. But here's where it gets interesting. Psychologists who study attachment theory, the science of how early relationships shape the way we connect with others as adults, have found something worth sitting with. Children who grow up in environments with inconsistent or emotionally unavailable caregivers don't become helpless. They adapt. They become self-reliant to a degree that looks from the outside like extraordinary competence. And it is competence, genuinely. But it comes wrapped around a very old wound. The clinical term is avoidant attachment. It describes a pattern where a person has learned to suppress their need for closeness and support. Not because they don't feel it, but because expressing it felt too risky, too unrewarded, or too painful in the past. The brain essentially creates a workaround. It says, I won't need you. That way you can't let me down. What this looks like in real life is a person who handles everything, who never asks for directions, who would rather research their own medical symptoms for 3 hours than call a doctor, who says I'm fine with total conviction while quietly carrying everything alone. Sound familiar? Now here's the part that matters. Because this is where hyper-independence gets complicated. There are actually a few different ways this pattern shows up in people, and they don't all look the same from the outside. Let's call the first type the fortress builder. This is the Gen Xer who has constructed an entire identity around not needing anyone. They're the most capable person in any room. They fix things. They manage things. They know how to handle a crisis without flinching, and they are genuinely proud of this. But somewhere private in the 3 a.m. quiet, in the middle of a hard year, there's a tiredness that goes beyond exhaustion, a loneliness they can't quite name, because they built the walls so well that even the people who love them can't always find the door. The second type is the reluctant delegator. This person knows intellectually that they should ask for help. They've probably even been told to. But every time they try, something inside them takes over. They end up just doing it themselves because it's easier, because they don't want to explain it, because they don't want to owe anyone anything, because waiting for someone else to help feels more stressful than the task itself. The control isn't about arrogance, it's about anxiety. It's about a deep, bone-level discomfort with vulnerability that they can't always explain. And the third type is the silent sufferer. This one is the hardest to see. Because from the outside, they look fine. They look stable. They keep showing up. But internally, they are managing an enormous amount: grief, stress, health concerns, financial pressure, without ever naming it out loud. Not because they're strong, because they genuinely don't know how to ask. The words don't come. The request doesn't form. Because somewhere along the way, they learned that expressing need was either pointless or punished. And that lesson went in deep. Tell me which one of these sounds the most like you. Drop it in the comments. Now let's talk about what this actually does to a person, because the research here is worth paying attention to. Studies on chronic self-reliance, specifically in adults who developed avoidant attachment patterns early in life, show a consistent pattern. The stress doesn't disappear just because it's not expressed. It gets stored in the body, in the nervous system, in elevated baseline cortisol levels that the person often doesn't even notice because they've been running this way for so long it feels like normal. And here's what most people don't realize. Hyperindependence isn't just emotionally isolating, it's physiologically expensive. Research in psychoneuroimmunology, the science of how the mind, nervous system, and immune system interact, shows that chronic suppression of emotional needs and social connection is linked to higher rates of cardiovascular stress, disrupted sleep, and compromised immune function. The body keeps score, as the researchers say, and it doesn't care how competent you are. But here's the thing that gets lost in all the science. The person who developed this pattern didn't choose it. A child who grew up in a household where emotional needs were met with silence or impatience didn't decide to stop asking. They learned, efficiently, brilliantly, even. The nervous system that figured out how to survive in an environment that wasn't fully safe. That's not a broken nervous system. That's an incredibly adaptive one. And now that adaptive pattern is living inside an adult body, in a different world, with different people, and still running the same old code. That's not weakness. That's the echo of survival. Think about the last time someone offered to help you with something, a friend, a partner, a coworker, and your first instinct was to say no, not because you didn't need the help, but because something in you immediately started calculating the cost. What will I owe them? What if they do it wrong? What if needing help means something about me? That calculation isn't logic. That's old wiring. That's the child who learned to read the room doing its job, decades later in a room that's completely different now. And for a generation that grew up being celebrated for its self-sufficiency, the original DIY generation, the generation that figured out the internet before anyone taught them how, there's a particular kind of grief in recognizing that some of that independence wasn't chosen. It was coped into existence. The hyper-independent person isn't someone who doesn't need connection. They're someone who learned to need it quietly, to want support without asking for it, to hope someone would notice without having to say a word, because saying the word felt like stepping onto ice they weren't sure would hold. You're not broken, you're not cold, and you're not too far gone to learn a different way of being, if that's what you want. But that choice has to start with understanding where the pattern came from. Not blaming, not fixing, just seeing it clearly. The kid who figured out how to hold everything together in a house that wasn't always steady, they didn't fail, they survived. And that survival took real courage, even if it cost something along the way. If this felt like something you've been thinking about for a long time but couldn't quite put into words, I'm glad it found you today. If it resonated, please subscribe. There's more of this kind of depth waiting for you here. The next video is going to hit differently. It goes somewhere even quieter, even closer to the parts of yourself you don't usually talk about out loud. I'll see you there.